The evening sun cast long, amber shadows across the spacious living room of the Brown family's elegant suburban home. The warmth and serenity that usually filled the space felt distant, replaced by an unsettling tension. 9-year-old Delilah lay curled up on the plush leather couch, her small hands pressing against her stomach as she fought waves of pain. Her usually radiant, curious face was etched with discomfort, her soft brown curls damp with sweat. Maya Brown knelt beside her daughter, holding a steaming cup of peppermint tea. "Sweetie, let's try just a sip. It might help settle your stomach," she said gently, brushing the curls from Delilah's forehead with a mother's tender touch. Delilah shook her head slowly, her eyes squeezed shut. "It hurts too much, Mommy," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that nearly broke Maya's heart. Jason Brown, Delilah's father, stood nearby, his restless pacing filling the otherwise quiet room. His tailored suit and polished loafers felt oddly out of place in the midst of his family's distress. But his demeanor was anything but calm. Every few minutes, his eyes darted to his watch, his brows knitted with deep worry. "The medicine Dr. Parker prescribed, it should have started working by now. Right?" Jason asked, his voice tinged with irritation and helplessness. Maya sighed, holding Delilah's hand. "She needs something more than tea or medicine from a bottle. Jason, she's barely eaten in days. This isn't right." Jason paused, watching his daughter as her small frame shivered on the couch. He dropped to one knee beside her, his usually commanding presence softened by a father's concern. "Princess," he said softly, "can you tell us where it hurts the most?" Delilah's eyes opened just a little, the effort making her wince. She lifted one shaky hand and pointed to the lower right side of her stomach. "Here, it hurts more when I move." Jason and Maya shared a glance filled with the unspoken fear only parents know. They had tried everything over the past few days: crackers, ginger ale, heating pads, every remedy they could think of. But nothing had worked, and the sight of their once lively little girl in such distress was becoming too much to bear. Maya reached out to Jason, her voice a low murmur. "This isn't a stomach bug. Jason, something's wrong. She's in real pain." Jason pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. "I'm calling Metropolitan Hospital. They're supposed to be the best in the city. If anyone can help, it's them." Maya nodded, squeezing Delilah's hand as they stood in the doorway, keeping watch over their daughter. The sight of her lying so still, her usually vibrant spirit dulled by discomfort, sent a chill through them both. The clock on the wall ticked past 10, the night growing deeper. With every passing second, Jason's resolve solidified. He bent down to Delilah, cupping her face gently. "Sweetheart, tomorrow, we're going to take you to a special place with doctors who will figure out what's wrong. They're going to help you feel better. I promise." Delilah's tired eyes found his, the faintest glimmer of relief in her gaze. "Promise?" she whispered, her small fingers clutching his hand as if he were her only anchor in a storm of pain and confusion. Jason nodded, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I promise, Princess," as he stepped into his home office to make the necessary calls. Maya stayed by Delilah's side, her voice a soft lullaby as she hummed a familiar tune. Despite the warmth and safety of her home, the night stretched long and heavy, filled with the quiet, desperate hope that tomorrow would finally bring their little girl some relief. The next morning, the Browns arrived at Metropolitan Hospital as dawn broke, casting a cool, sterile light across the city streets. The hospital lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and pristine artwork, exuding a promise of care and expertise. Jason led the way, his confident stride matching the crisp lines of his suit, his face set with determination. Maya walked beside him, supporting Delilah, who held her stomach tightly as she shuffled forward, her face pale with pain. "Good morning," Jason said as they approached the reception desk, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. "Jason Brown. I called earlier about my daughter, Delilah." The receptionist's eyes widened, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she recognized the name. "Yes, Mr. Brown. We've been expecting you. Dr. Gomez is ready to see her now." They were soon escorted to a private lounge, far removed from the busier areas of the hospital. It was an upscale space, with comfortable leather chairs, gentle lighting, and a soothing water feature cascading down one wall. Delilah sank into a chair, leaning against Maya's shoulder, her face drawn and weary. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" Maya asked, brushing Delilah's curls from her forehead. "It still hurts, Mommy," Delilah murmured, her voice barely audible. Jason's eyes scanned the room, his worry visible in the tension across his brow. His reflection in the glass showed a father whose confidence was shadowed by concern. A man accustomed to fixing problems but now helpless in the face of his daughter's pain. Moments later, a nurse in crisp scrubs appeared, ushering them down the hall to meet Dr. Gomez. They walked through a maze of sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls felt close, the air thick with antiseptic and formality, as if to reinforce that they were in the realm of professionals where appearances mattered more than warmth. Dr. Christopher Gomez's office was grand yet cold. He sat behind an imposing oak desk, his white coat pressed to perfection and his silver hair slicked back with careful precision. As they entered, he rose, extending his hand to Jason. But his attention was almost entirely on him, with only a brief nod to Maya and barely a glance at Delilah. "Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brown," he greeted, his voice smooth and practiced. "Please, take a seat." Jason helped Delilah into a chair and sat beside her, clearing his throat. "This is our daughter, Delilah. She's been experiencing severe stomach pain for days now." Dr. Gomez picked up a pen, tapping it lightly against his notepad. His eyes remained on Jason, an air of detached professionalism radiating from him. "And what symptoms has she displayed?" Maya leaned forward, encouraging Delilah. "Sweetie, tell Dr. Gomez where it hurts." But before Delilah could speak, Dr. Gomez waved a dismissive hand. "Perhaps you could describe the symptoms, Mr. Brown. It will be more efficient." Maya's face tightened, a flicker of anger crossing her features. She held back, watching as Jason described the events of the past few days, the sleepless nights, the failed remedies, the hope they'd placed in today's visit. Throughout Jason's explanation, Dr. Gomez's expression barely changed. He nodded occasionally, his pen moving methodically across his notepad. But his posture was stiff, his gaze unfeeling. When Delilah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, letting out a small whimper, Dr. Gomez's attention didn't stray. "Well," Dr. Gomez said at last, his tone clinical and clipped, "we'll need to run some tests. Standard procedure." He scribbled on his prescription pad with a brisk finality. Jason and Maya exchanged a worried glance. They couldn't ignore the doctor's cold demeanor, but the reputation of the hospital and Dr. Gomez's expertise convinced them to stay hopeful. "When can we start the tests?" Jason asked, placing a protective hand on Delilah's shoulder. Dr. Gomez didn't look up from his notes. "The nurse will provide you with the necessary paperwork," he replied, already reaching for his computer. "She'll be with you shortly." The examination room felt sterile and impersonal, with its harsh fluorescent lights and metal fixtures. Delilah perched on the edge of the examination table, her small hands clutching the crinkling paper beneath her, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with visible unease. Jason and Maya stood close by, their bodies tense with concern. Dr. Gomez entered the room, clipboard in hand, his shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. He glanced briefly at Delilah, then turned his gaze toward Jason once more. "We'll start with a few routine questions," he said, ignoring Delilah as he addressed her father. "Has there been any change in her diet recently?" Maya stepped forward, her voice firm and calm, though a mother's fire burned beneath her words. "Delilah can answer that herself, Doctor. She knows best how she feels." Dr. Gomez's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Reluctantly, he turned to Delilah, his eyes skimming over her with a clear reluctance, as if she were more an inconvenience than a patient. "Very well," he said, his tone icy. "What seems to be the problem?" Delilah's voice was soft, hesitant. "My stomach hurts, especially here." She pointed to her lower abdomen, her small finger trembling. "I feel sick when I try to eat. Even the foods I love don't taste good anymore." Dr. Gomez muttered, his brow barely lifting. I suppose that's what happens when you people insist on eating all those spicy foods. These ethnic dishes aren't exactly gentle on the stomach. Are they? The room fell silent. Maya's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while Jason's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Delilah looked up at the doctor, her wide eyes shimmering with confusion and hurt. I beg your pardon? Maya's voice was barely a whisper, her shock mingling with a rising anger. Dr. Gomez continued as if he hadn't heard her, scribbling away on his clipboard. It's quite common. If you'd stick to a more conventional diet, we wouldn't be having this problem. He looked up then, his eyes skimming over Delilah as if she were a bothersome afterthought. Jason's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Dr. Gomez continued with a final, cutting remark. And let's be honest, he said, his tone filled with quiet disdain. This kind of thing happens all the time with your sort. If you people ate like normal Americans, I'm sure she'd be fine. Delilah's small face crumpled as fresh tears welled in her eyes. She looked down, her shoulders hunching as if to make herself smaller, as if she could disappear from the sharp, belittling gaze of the man who was supposed to help her. Jason's breath came fast and shallow, his anger simmering beneath the surface. But he held it in check, his focus shifting to Delilah as she slid off the examination table, her small body trembling with silent sobs. With one last pained look at her parents, she bolted from the room, her footsteps echoing in the cold, sterile hallway as she ran from the hurt and humiliation she'd just endured. In that moment, Jason knew, they were no longer here to find answers. They were here to make sure no other child, no other family ever faced this kind of prejudice again. Jason sat alone in his home office that night, the world around him dim and silent. His daughter's tear-streaked face haunted him, an image he couldn't shake no matter how many times he replayed the day's events in his mind. Dr. Gomez's harsh words and callous dismissal echoed like poison. In a place where Delilah should have found relief, she had instead encountered cruelty, deep, prejudiced cruelty that had struck her as surely as any physical wound. As he clenched his hands tightly, Jason felt his control slipping. He had faced tough situations before, but he had never felt such a visceral need to protect, to avenge, and to demand justice. And for his little girl, a 9-year-old who now knew what it was like to be made to feel small. To feel wrong simply for being herself. The faint hum of the city lights outside was the only sound in the room as Jason reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, each name flashing by in a blur. These were powerful people, colleagues, old friends, and business partners he'd come to know through years of building his business empire. Tonight, his influence would no longer be reserved for boardrooms and negotiations. Tonight, he was a father on a mission. Without hesitation, he dialed James, his close friend and lawyer, someone he trusted implicitly. James picked up on the second ring. Jason. James's voice was calm but laced with concern. Sensing the intensity in Jason's silence. What's going on? It's about Delilah, Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. Today, at Metropolitan Hospital, he took a breath, steadying himself as the memory of Dr. Gomez's sneer surfaced again. She was humiliated, James, belittled by that man, that doctor. He dismissed her pain, blamed her heritage, blamed us. I've never seen her so broken. There was a long pause on the other end. When James spoke, his tone had changed, cold and serious. What do you need me to do? I want an investigation, Jason replied, each word deliberate. I want this doctor, Dr. Gomez, held accountable for every word he said to her. For every time he's ever made a family feel less. I want to know everything about him, his career, his complaints, his hidden skeletons. I don't care what it takes, James. I don't care what it costs. Consider it done, James said without hesitation. I'll start tonight. And Jason, we'll get justice for Delilah. You have my word. As Jason hung up, a sense of purpose overtook him, pushing past the initial wave of anger. He felt like a soldier readying himself for battle, determined and fierce. But he wouldn't be satisfied with a small victory. He wanted something more significant. Something lasting. Jason's fingers hovered over his phone again, this time calling the hospital director, Dr. Patricia Chen, a formidable leader who prided herself on the integrity of her institution. He'd met her briefly at fundraisers. But tonight, he wasn't calling as a donor or an ally. Tonight, he was a father demanding answers. The call was brief, but it served its purpose. Dr. Chen, Jason said, his voice firm and controlled. Your hospital has a serious issue. My daughter was mistreated and demeaned by one of your physicians today, Dr. Gomez. I'm expecting immediate action. I will not let this slide. Dr. Chen's tone was quick and apologetic. Mr. Brown, please accept my apologies on behalf of Metropolitan. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you, we will address this. You have 1 day, Dr. Chen, Jason said coldly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. I expect to hear from you with a solution. If not, you'll hear from my lawyers. When the call ended, Jason leaned back, his jaw clenched. He knew what people would say, that he was using his power and wealth to exact revenge. But this wasn't about vengeance, it was about protecting Delilah and ensuring that no one else had to face what she had. By morning, Dr. Chen had organized an emergency board meeting. Word had spread quickly through the hospital staff, and whispers of Jason Brown's name filled the halls. People knew his reputation, his influence, and the weight his words carried. This wasn't a small matter that could be swept under the rug. This was a crisis. As the board members convened in the sterile conference room, Dr. Gomez was summoned, his usual confidence replaced by a hint of unease. He walked into the room under the scrutiny of a dozen pairs of eyes. His posture slightly slouched, his lips pressed into a thin line. Dr. Chen stood at the head of the table, her voice steady and unyielding. Dr. Gomez, she began, we have received a serious complaint regarding your treatment of a young patient. Delilah Brown, we expect a full account of your actions. Dr. Gomez cleared his throat, his voice quiet and lacking conviction. I may have been somewhat dismissive, he muttered, refusing to meet the gaze of the others in the room. The family seemed sensitive. Dr. Chen's expression remained stern, her voice icy. Mr. and Mrs. Brown have alleged that your behavior went beyond mere dismissiveness. They claim you made discriminatory remarks that humiliated a 9-year-old girl in pain. Dr. Gomez's jaw tightened. Children misinterpret things. I simply recommended dietary adjustments. That's all. You people, one board member read from a transcript, her voice taut with anger, is not an appropriate phrase to use with a patient. Dr. Gomez, it suggests prejudice and a lack of professionalism, qualities we cannot tolerate at Metropolitan. Dr. Gomez's face flushed as he struggled for words. I didn't mean. That's enough. Dr. Chen interrupted, her voice sharp. You have a history of complaints regarding your treatment of minority patients. Dr. Gomez, this will not be ignored. You are hereby suspended pending further investigation. As the words left Dr. Chen's mouth, the color drained from Dr. Gomez's face. He opened his mouth to protest, but the stony faces around him silenced any arguments. The board had made their decision, and his usual charm and excuses wouldn't save him this time. Hours later, back in his own office, Jason felt a grim satisfaction as he learned of the outcome. The suspension, while satisfying, felt like only the beginning. He knew that a month's suspension was a weak penalty, a mere slap on the wrist that did little to address the harm Dr. Gomez had caused to Delilah and to countless others. The ache in his heart persisted, the memory of Delilah's trembling form and tearful eyes a constant reminder of his failure to shield her. He wouldn't rest until he'd done more, until the system that allowed this prejudice was dismantled piece by piece. As Jason leaned forward, his hands clasped together, he made a silent vow to himself and to his daughter. He wouldn't just demand change, he would build it. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Jason's office, casting a golden glow over the polished mahogany of his desk. Normally, this was a place of calm and control, where he mapped out business strategies and calculated investments. But today, his focus was entirely different. Stacks of folders and papers were scattered before him, each page, each line of text, a clue that might uncover the real Dr. Christopher Gomez. Jason was no stranger to digging deep, but this felt personal. It wasn't just a hunt for truth, it was a mission to expose a man who'd shattered his daughter's sense of safety and dignity. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. And Marcus, Jason's trusted assistant, entered carrying a thick manila folder. Marcus's face was unreadable, but the depth of the research in his hands suggested that what he had found was troubling. "Sir," Marcus began, setting the file down with a hint of caution. "I gathered everything we could find. Dr. Gomez, he has a history. A well-buried one. You might want to read through this." Jason's eyes narrowed as he opened the folder, spreading its contents across his desk. Here was everything. Dr. Gomez's professional credentials, employment history, financial records, and most concerning of all, records of complaints and patient grievances dating back years. Jason skimmed the pages with growing disbelief. Dr. Gomez had been the subject of numerous patient complaints, and while many had been quietly dismissed or resolved, there was a pattern emerging that Jason couldn't ignore. "He's done this before," Jason muttered, barely able to keep the anger from his voice. "Yes," Marcus confirmed, his tone respectful but firm. "There are complaints from 3 previous hospitals. Each one describes similar behavior: dismissiveness, racial bias, and prejudiced remarks toward minority patients. It seems like every time things got too heated, he either transferred to a new hospital or was quietly protected by internal reviews." Jason's fingers traced one of the complaints, his jaw tightening as he read. A mother had brought her teenage son to Dr. Gomez for severe chest pain, only to be dismissed with comments about dietary habits typical for his community. The boy later suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized at a different facility. The complaint had been buried, labeled as resolved, without any public record of disciplinary action. "This man has been given cover time and again," Jason growled, his voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "How can they let this happen? How can they ignore the suffering he's caused just to protect their reputation?" Marcus cleared his throat. "The evidence is damning, sir, but he's managed to avoid real consequences so far, likely due to his connections within the medical community. Hospitals value their image, and sometimes they prefer to quietly deal with problems rather than confront them head-on." Jason's mind raced, connecting the dots. The more he read, the clearer it became that Dr. Gomez had thrived within a system designed to shield him. This wasn't just one bad doctor, it was an institutional failure, a machine that protected the powerful and sacrificed the vulnerable. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was James, his friend and lawyer, who had been working all night to piece together the legal avenues they could pursue. "Jason," James began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency, "I've got news. I spoke to a few families who had similar experiences with Dr. Gomez. They're willing to come forward. They've been waiting for someone powerful enough to stand up for them." Jason's grip on the phone tightened. He thought of Delilah's frightened face, her tears, her quiet plea to never see Dr. Gomez again. These families must have felt the same helplessness, the same rage, and they had been forced to swallow it, to move on because they didn't have the resources to fight. "Get them ready," Jason said, his voice cold with determination. "Every single one of them. I want their stories documented. Every detail. Dr. Gomez and the hospitals that protected him are about to face the kind of accountability they've avoided for too long." "Understood," James replied, his voice filled with conviction. "This won't be easy. The hospital will fight back. Probably try to discredit these families and undermine the case." "Let them try," Jason responded, his tone hard. "We're going to expose everything: the complaints, the cover-ups, the negligence. If they want a fight, they're going to get one." Hours turned into days as Jason, James, and Marcus meticulously built their case. They interviewed families, each story adding to the weight of their evidence. They gathered medical records, statements, and testimony after testimony. Some families were hesitant, afraid of retaliation or of reliving painful memories. But Jason's presence, his unwavering support and promise of protection reassured them. For the first time, they felt they had an ally who could take on the system. One afternoon, Jason met with Sarah Johnson, a single mother whose son had suffered under Dr. Gomez's care. She was visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she recounted her story. Dr. Gomez didn't even look at Tommy properly, she said, her voice breaking. He just brushed him off. Like he wasn't worth his time. That night, we ended up in the ER because Dr. Gomez missed the signs of a serious infection. Tommy was in so much pain, and I didn't have the money to fight him or the hospital. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. I promise you. This time, he'll face consequences. This time, we're all going to fight together. Each family Jason met added fuel to his resolve. There was Robert Williams, an elderly man who'd been dismissed by Dr. Gomez after reporting chest pain, only to suffer a minor heart attack the following day. And Michelle Torres, a mother whose daughter had nearly died from a ruptured appendix after Dr. Gomez dismissed her symptoms as overreaction. Each story was a fresh reminder of the harm Dr. Gomez had caused. The trail of suffering he'd left behind. By the end of the week, Jason had documented the stories of 5 families, all of whom were ready to support his cause. As he sat in his office, the testimonies and records arranged before him like pieces of a dark puzzle. He felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he'd known before. This wasn't just about Delilah anymore. This was about every family who had been ignored. Every child whose pain had been dismissed. Every patient whose life had been endangered by prejudice disguised as professionalism. Jason's resolve hardened. He looked at the photo of Delilah on his desk. Her bright smile captured in a moment before the hospital visit that had changed everything. He would not let her down. He would not let these families down. Picking up his phone, he dialed James. It's time to take this public. Jason said, I want every media outlet to know what's happened. I want the world to hear these stories. James's voice was steady. Are you sure, Jason? Once this is out there, the hospital will fight us with everything they've got. This could get ugly. Let it get ugly, Jason replied, his voice filled with unshakable conviction. They hid behind bureaucracy for too long, letting someone like Gomez thrive. It's time they're forced to confront their failures. As Jason hung up, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a fierce, clear resolve. This wasn't just a father's fight for his daughter, it was a battle for justice. A reckoning for every family that had been dismissed and silenced. And he wouldn't stop until they won. The energy in Jason's office was electric. The usual hum of keyboards and quiet murmur of business calls had been replaced by the intensity of a command center preparing for battle. Jason's legal team, led by his trusted friend James and his assistant Marcus, moved quickly, assembling documents, reviewing statements, and preparing every detail needed for what would become a landmark case. The walls, once adorned with accolades and photos of Jason's business triumphs, now held pinned testimonies, charts, and timelines that mapped out Dr. Gomez's systematic negligence and prejudice. Jason sat at the head of the table, a dozen eyes on him as he addressed his team. I want us prepared to expose not only Dr. Gomez but the entire system that allowed him to harm these families. He said, his voice steady, resolute. We're not just fighting one man, we're challenging an entire institution. As Jason spoke, he was keenly aware of the strength in the room. These were some of the sharpest legal minds in the country. Experts in uncovering corruption. Professionals who knew how to dissect every legal loophole and avenue. They understood that this was more than a legal battle, it was a mission for justice. Their collective determination reflected in their focused expressions and the hard lines of resolve etched into their faces. One by one, the families who had suffered under Dr. Gomez's care arrived, each one bringing with them a story that added to the case's weight. The families filled nearly 2 full rows of seats around the long table. Their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. Some clutched manila folders containing medical records, others held faded copies of complaints that had gone unanswered. This time, they would not be ignored. Jason took the floor, greeting each family with a warm handshake and a quiet word of reassurance. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the weariness of fighting against an invisible force for so long. When everyone was seated, he stood before them, his voice carrying the weight of both a promise and a challenge. Thank you all for being here. Jason began, making eye contact with each person. Your courage in coming forward has been nothing short of inspiring. Together, we're going to make sure that no other child, No other parent ever has to endure what you've endured. Sarah Johnson, the single mother who had been dismissed by Dr. Gomez, dabbed at her eyes, clearly emotional. We've felt so alone for so long, she said softly, her voice quivering. I never thought anyone would care enough to help us fight back. Jason nodded, feeling a surge of empathy. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. None of you are. He gestured to the team around them. Every lawyer and advocate listening attentively. We are with you, and we are going to give you the justice you deserve. James, the head of Jason's legal team, stepped forward, projecting confidence as he addressed the room. The strength of our case lies in your combined stories, he said. Dr. Gomez's pattern of behavior is undeniable when presented together. Individually, they could explain away these incidents as misunderstandings. But together, your testimonies paint a damning picture of systematic discrimination. Robert Williams, an elderly man who had been dismissed by Dr. Gomez when he reported chest pain, raised his hand, his expression one of cautious hope. What about the costs? He asked, his voice heavy with worry. Most of us don't have the money to go up against a hospital. Jason stepped forward, meeting Robert's eyes with a steady gaze. You don't need to worry about that, he said firmly. I'm covering all legal expenses. Every single one. This fight isn't just for Delilah, it's for all of you. You've been mistreated and silenced for far too long. We're here to make sure your voices are heard. A wave of relief washed over the room. Michelle Torres, another mother in the group, clutched her young son's hand tightly. I felt so helpless back then, she said, her voice filled with emotion. But seeing all of you here, seeing that we're stronger together, it changes everything. The legal team began to explain the process ahead, laying out the steps for the class action lawsuit. Each family would be given time to share their story in court, and each incident would be meticulously documented and presented. Marcus and James assured them that the hospital would be held accountable, no matter how fiercely they tried to defend Dr. Gomez's actions. As the meeting continued, the room transformed. The uncertainty that had clouded the family's faces began to lift, replaced by a fierce determination. This was no longer just a group of individuals with grievances, they had become a unified front. A coalition demanding justice. Jason felt a surge of pride as he looked around the room. This was exactly what he had envisioned, a gathering of people standing up, not just for themselves, but for each other. As he moved from one family to the next, thanking them for their courage, he noticed the spark of hope returning to their eyes. When the formal meeting ended, the families lingered, talking with one another, exchanging phone numbers and words of encouragement. They no longer saw themselves as victims, they were now allies. United by their shared experience and driven by a collective purpose. Jason watched as Robert Williams approached Sarah Johnson, patting her on the shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. Across the room, Michelle Torres spoke quietly to another mother, her expression fierce yet hopeful. This network of support was growing stronger, and as Jason observed, he realized that they were building something even larger than the lawsuit. They were creating a community, one that would continue long after this battle had ended. As the families began to file out, Jason addressed his legal team one last time. Let's get to work, he said, his voice brimming with conviction. We've got a fight ahead of us, and we're not going to back down. The attorneys nodded, their faces alight with purpose. This was more than a case to them now, it was a cause. A stand against the kind of systemic injustice that too often went unchallenged. Outside, the sky was starting to darken, but within the walls of Jason's office, a new light had ignited. This fight was no longer just about revenge. It was about healing, about accountability, and about rewriting a broken system that had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. With his mind buzzing with the plans to come, Jason looked once more at the photograph of Delilah on his desk. Her smile, innocent and bright, served as both a reminder and a promise that he would see this through to the end. Not just for her but for every single family that had suffered in silence. Jason knew the path ahead would be steep, the resistance fierce, but he was ready. This was just the beginning. They were no longer just patients, they were a movement. And they would make sure that Dr. Gomez and those who protected him would finally be held accountable. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold. a bright light casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Families gathered in clusters outside, exchanging words of encouragement, while reporters and camera crews formed a thick crowd along the entrance, eager to capture every moment of what had quickly become a sensational story. The trial of Dr. Christopher Gomez had drawn attention far beyond the city, sparking conversations about medical accountability and systemic discrimination. Jason stood at the courthouse entrance, watching as each family walked inside, each face marked by a blend of hope, fear, and determination. He greeted them individually, shaking hands, exchanging a few quiet words. Today, they would share their stories in a public forum. And today, Dr. Gomez's years of cruelty would finally be exposed. Inside, the courtroom was buzzing with hushed conversations. Jason's legal team prepared at the plaintiff's table, their expressions serious and focused. At the defense table, Dr. Gomez sat stiffly, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The doctor's face was pale, his usually confident demeanor replaced by visible tension. Gone was the air of superiority that had characterized him. He looked like a man slowly realizing the gravity of his actions. When the judge entered the room, a hush fell. "All rise," called the bailiff, and everyone stood as Judge Sarah Martinez, a woman known for her integrity and commitment to justice, took her seat. Her calm, no-nonsense demeanor signaled that this would be a thorough, impartial proceeding. Jason sat in the front row with the families, feeling the weight of the moment. As he looked around, he could see the quiet courage in their faces. They had waited for this day, some for years, and now it was finally here. James, Jason's lead attorney, rose to deliver the opening statement. His voice was clear, every word carefully chosen to resonate with both the jury and the families. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," James began, his gaze steady and direct. "This is not just a case about one doctor and a handful of complaints. This is a case about trust that patients place in the medical professionals sworn to care for them. Today, you will hear how Dr. Gomez betrayed that trust, time and time again, dismissing the pain and suffering of his patients simply because of who they were. We will show you how this man, entrusted with the care of our most vulnerable, used his position to belittle, humiliate, and ultimately endanger those he was supposed to protect." The courtroom sat in silence, every eye on James as he continued. "The plaintiffs you see here today, these brave families, are only a fraction of those affected by Dr. Gomez's actions. Their stories reveal a pattern of prejudice and neglect that has gone unpunished for too long. Today, we ask you to hold him accountable." As James returned to his seat, a palpable tension hung in the room. The jury looked on, their faces set with determination as they prepared to hear the evidence. The first witness, Sarah Johnson, took the stand. Jason watched as she steadied herself, gripping the edges of the witness stand tightly. She began to recount the day she had taken her son, Tommy, to see Dr. Gomez, her voice wavering but growing stronger with each word. "Tommy was in so much pain," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But Dr. Gomez barely looked at him. He dismissed us like we were nothing. He told me it was just an overreaction and sent us home. Later that night, we ended up in the emergency room. Tommy's appendix had burst." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Dr. Gomez's lawyer objected, trying to downplay the incident. But Judge Martinez overruled, allowing Sarah to continue. With each sentence, she painted a picture of a doctor who had not only neglected his duties but had acted with cold indifference to the people who depended on him. Next, Robert Williams took the stand. Jason felt a surge of admiration for the elderly man as he stood tall, his gaze steady. "Dr. Gomez dismissed my chest pains as indigestion," Robert said, his voice calm but resolute. "He laughed it off, saying it was typical for people like me to worry too much. The next day, I suffered a heart attack." Jason could feel the anger building in the courtroom. Each story revealed a more damning picture of Dr. Gomez, a doctor who had used his authority to undermine, humiliate, and ignore the very people he was supposed to help. Michelle Torres, whose young daughter had nearly died after Dr. Gomez dismissed her symptoms, was the third witness. Tears streamed down her face as she described the fear, the helplessness, The frustration of knowing her daughter's life had been in the hands of a man who didn't care. Throughout the testimonies, Jason glanced over at Dr. Gomez, who sat slumped in his chair, his face drained of color. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a flicker of something that looked like fear. The reality of his actions and the consequences was finally beginning to set in. The defense tried to counter each story, attempting to cast doubt on the family's accounts. They claimed misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and even overreactions by the patients. But with each attempt, James and the legal team countered expertly, bringing in documentation of prior complaints, medical records, and statements from staff who had witnessed Dr. Gomez's treatment firsthand. Finally, the prosecution presented records from 3 hospitals where Dr. Gomez had previously worked. Each one revealed a troubling pattern of complaints that had been swept under the rug. Jason felt a surge of satisfaction as the courtroom listened in stunned silence to the records being read aloud. After hours of testimonies, cross-examinations, and heated exchanges, Dr. Gomez was called to the stand. His lawyer had advised against it, but the doctor insisted, eager to defend himself. He sat, adjusting his tie nervously, his gaze avoiding the jury's. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaky, "I have served this community for years. These allegations are misunderstandings. Yes, I was sometimes under stress. But I have always acted with the best intentions." James rose for the cross-examination, his tone sharp, his questions precise. "Dr. Gomez, is it your usual practice to dismiss patients by commenting on their dietary habits or people like them? Would you consider that professional?" Dr. Gomez stammered, his face flushed. I was just trying to identify potential causes. Some patients take things too personally." "Too personally?" James repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "A mother who rushes her son to the ER after you ignore his symptoms is taking things too personally?" The doctor's face turned a deep shade of red. "I never meant. I didn't." "Didn't what?" James pressed, his voice rising slightly. "Didn't intend to harm, or didn't care enough to see the harm you were causing?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Dr. Gomez sat, his shoulders slumped, unable to answer. Jason watched him closely, feeling a surge of satisfaction. For the first time, Dr. Gomez was facing the full weight of his actions. And he was crumbling under it. As Dr. Gomez stepped down, the judge called a recess. Jason stepped outside with the families, feeling the energy shift among them. They were no longer afraid. They had stood up to Dr. Gomez, shared their stories, and now the world was listening. One of the reporters approached Jason as he stood with the families. "Mr. Brown, do you think this trial will lead to real change in how hospitals handle complaints?" Jason met her gaze, his eyes fierce. "It has to," he said. "This case isn't just about Dr. Gomez. It's about a broken system that protects doctors at the expense of patients. If we can bring this to light, maybe we can stop this from happening to anyone else." As he spoke, he felt a surge of purpose. This battle was about more than Delilah or any single patient. It was about dismantling a system that allowed prejudice to thrive. About demanding that those in power be held accountable. As the courtroom reconvened, Jason took his seat, ready to see the case through to the end. The defense's arguments had weakened, and the family's voices had grown stronger. In that room, justice felt within reach, and Jason knew that the truth would finally be undeniable. This was their moment, a moment to expose the truth, to demand accountability, and to pave the way for a future where no patient would ever feel invisible again. The courtroom was silent as Judge Martinez returned, her face as impassive as ever, carrying the weight of the decision. Jason could feel the tension building around him, a nearly tangible force as every family member sat with bated breath. He glanced over at Sarah Johnson, who was clutching her son's hand tightly, and Robert Williams, whose eyes were fixed on the judge with a quiet determination. Today would be the day they learned if all their courage, all their vulnerability in reliving painful memories, had been worth it. At the defendant's table, Dr. Gomez sat with his head bowed, his confidence and arrogance drained from him over the course of the trial. He looked like a shadow of the man he once was, a man who had thrived on the power that his title and position had afforded him. Now, That title was on trial. And the world was watching. Judge Martinez cleared her throat and began. In the matter of Dr. Christopher Gomez and the charges of medical negligence and discriminatory behavior, we have carefully reviewed the testimonies and evidence provided by the plaintiffs. This trial has brought to light a pattern of behavior that challenges the principles of trust and care that are foundational to the medical profession. The words settled heavily over the room, each syllable striking like a bell tolling for justice. Jason felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment they had all fought for. The moment where they would find out if their voices would finally be heard. Judge Martinez continued, her voice steady and commanding. The court finds that Dr. Gomez demonstrated a consistent disregard for the well-being of his patients. His actions not only endangered lives but were also marked by prejudice that has no place in the practice of medicine. Dr. Gomez's behavior was not an isolated incident, but a recurring pattern that has caused undue harm to numerous individuals under his care. Jason closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him. He opened them again to see the reaction on the faces of those around him. Sarah Johnson's shoulders relaxed as if an immense weight had been lifted. And Robert Williams allowed himself a small, triumphant nod. The families had become a unified force throughout the trial, and this decision felt like a victory for all of them. Judge Martinez wasn't finished. As a result, the court rules in favor of the plaintiffs. Dr. Gomez will be stripped of his medical license effective immediately. Furthermore, the hospital, Metropolitan General, will be required to pay substantial damages to the affected families, and an independent investigation will be launched into their complaint handling processes. A murmur swept through the courtroom as the weight of the decision sank in. For years, these families had lived with the knowledge that their pain had been ignored, that their suffering had been dismissed. But today, they had reclaimed their dignity, and justice had finally been served. Jason felt a swell of pride and relief, but also a sense of resolve. He knew this was only the beginning. There were still many steps ahead, ensuring that the hospital made meaningful changes, that policies were updated, and that a standard of care and respect would be established for all patients. Regardless of their background, Dr. Gomez's face had turned ashen as he listened to the judge's ruling. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Dr. Gomez seemed beyond words. His face blank as he realized the gravity of his actions. This wasn't simply the end of his career, it was a complete unraveling of the power he had wielded so recklessly. As the families began to gather their things, reporters outside the courtroom prepared to capture the aftermath. Jason stood with the families, offering them quiet words of encouragement and reminding them that this victory belonged to each of them. They had shown incredible bravery and resilience, and he was proud to have stood by their side. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters and news cameras, ready to broadcast the day's events. Jason walked out with Sarah, Robert, Michelle, and the other families, standing as a united front against the sea of flashing lights and questions. Reporters immediately swarmed, microphones extended, questions flying in every direction. One reporter called out, "Mr. Brown, do you believe this case will bring about real change?" Jason turned, his voice clear and steady. "Yes, I do. This case was about more than just one man's actions. It was about exposing a system that allowed prejudice to go unchecked. Today, we took a stand for accountability. And that is a powerful first step. But the work is far from over." Another reporter asked, "What's next for the families affected?" Jason glanced back at the families gathered behind him, their faces a mixture of relief and hope. These families have fought for justice. And they've won. Now, they deserve healing, respect, and support. I'll be working with each of them to ensure that their medical bills are taken care of and that they have resources to move forward. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And for Metropolitan General and every other institution, let this case be a message. No patient should ever feel invisible. And no family should ever feel powerless in the face of injustice. Change is coming, and we will see it through. The crowd erupted in a flurry of camera flashes and applause. As Jason stepped away from the reporters, he felt a sense of closure, a deep satisfaction knowing that he had delivered on his promise. But as he looked back at the courthouse, He knew this victory would carry a ripple effect, one that would continue to challenge the medical community to confront and dismantle its biases. As the families prepared to go their separate ways, Sarah approached him, a small, grateful smile on her face. "Thank you, Mr. Brown. You made us feel like we mattered. You made us feel seen." Jason smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've always mattered, Sarah. Today, the world just finally took notice." With those parting words, Jason walked back to his car, feeling a rare peace settle over him. For Delilah, for these families, and for every patient who had suffered silently, justice had finally been served. But Jason knew that this was only the beginning. He had started a movement, one that would continue to grow, fueled by the stories and strength of those who had refused to be silenced. This battle had been won, but the fight for change was far from over, and as long as there were voices that needed lifting, Jason was ready to stand by their side. Months passed since the verdict, but the impact of the trial reverberated across the city and beyond. Jason's office had become a beacon for those seeking justice, a place where anyone who felt wronged or unseen could find support, guidance, and hope. Families from all walks of life reached out to Jason, each one with a story of discrimination, mistreatment, or prejudice that had gone unanswered until now. Jason had expected the case to bring about change, but he hadn't anticipated the wave of reform that followed. Hospitals, clinics, and medical institutions across the country began re-evaluating their policies, implementing stricter guidelines for handling patient complaints, and mandating comprehensive diversity training for their staff. Major networks covered the case, highlighting the need for systemic change within the healthcare industry and beyond. The trial had exposed more than just one doctor's negligence. It had revealed cracks in the very foundations of patient care and accountability. In his office, Jason sat surrounded by letters from people he had never met: patients, doctors, students, even former colleagues of Dr. Gomez. Some thanked him for his courage, while others expressed a newfound determination to stand up for their rights. Each letter was a testament to the lives touched by the trial, each one a reminder that they were all part of something larger. One afternoon, Delilah entered his office, a bright smile on her face and a stack of papers in her hands. She was taller now, her eyes wiser, and her presence filled Jason with pride. She handed him the stack, which he saw was a collection of handwritten notes from her classmates and teachers. "What's all this?" he asked, looking through the letters. "It's from my school," Delilah explained, sitting beside him. "After everything that happened, I told my friends about the case, about standing up for what's right. Some of them even shared their own experiences. So, we started a little group at school to help each other. Now, it's grown into something much bigger." Jason raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Bigger, you say?" She nodded enthusiastically. "We meet every week, and other students have started joining. We talk about ways to support each other and to speak up when things aren't fair. We've even organized a community event to raise awareness about discrimination and bias." Jason felt a surge of emotion as he listened to his daughter's words. The trial had affected Delilah deeply, but it had also given her a voice and a sense of purpose. He could see in her eyes that she was determined to carry forward the legacy of what they had started together. "Dad," she said, looking at him with a seriousness beyond her years, "you taught me that it's not enough to just get angry when something's wrong. We have to do something about it. That's what I want to do. I want to help people the way you helped those families." Jason reached over and took her hand, pride and love filling his heart. "Delilah, you've already done more than I ever could have dreamed. I couldn't be prouder of you." The two of them sat in a comfortable silence, sharing a moment of quiet understanding. Delilah had not only survived her experience with Dr. Gomez but had transformed it into something powerful and constructive. She was no longer just a victim, she was a leader in her own right. As the months turned to years, Jason continued his work, driven by the belief that every voice mattered, that every story deserved to be heard. He built partnerships with other advocates, launched initiatives to educate communities about their rights, and even established a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of discrimination across healthcare, education, and housing. The foundation worked tirelessly to ensure that every individual, regardless of their race, background, or status, would be treated with dignity and respect. Through this work, Jason learned that true change wasn't just about winning a single battle. It was about creating ripples of impact, challenging each institution, each individual, to do better, to be better. One evening, as he was finishing up at his desk, he looked up to see Marcus, his loyal assistant, standing in the doorway. Marcus had been there from the beginning, a steady presence through the highs and lows of the fight. "You know, Jason," Marcus began, a hint of pride in his voice, "we've done a lot of good. The foundation is helping so many people, and the healthcare industry is making real changes because of what we started." Jason nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "Yes, but it's more than that," Marcus said. "It's not just about what we've accomplished. It's about the people whose lives are different now because of what you did. The young doctors who know they'll be held accountable. The patients who trust they'll be heard. And your daughter, she's inspired her whole school. You've created something that's going to last." Jason looked out the window, the city lights casting a warm glow across his office. He thought of the countless lives touched by their work, the families who had found peace, the patients who had reclaimed their dignity. And most of all, he thought of Delilah, whose courage had sparked a movement he could never have foreseen. "You know, Marcus," Jason replied, his voice quiet yet resolute, "I started this for Delilah. I wanted to protect her, to make sure she never felt powerless. But somewhere along the way, it became about so much more than that. It became about all of us." Marcus nodded, understanding. Sometimes, a single act of courage is all it takes to change everything. As Jason sat back in his chair, a deep sense of peace settled over him. He knew the road ahead would still be challenging, there would always be battles to fight, injustices to confront, but he was ready, and he was surrounded by people who believed in the same cause. They were building a world where no one would have to feel unseen or unheard again. And in that moment, Jason knew that this was just the beginning. The ripple effect of their fight for justice would continue, carried forward by each person who dared to stand up, each person who refused to back down. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they were changing the world, one voice at a time.